Hi, I'm Diane Hullett, and welcome to the Best Life, Best Death podcast. Today, I've got a really interesting guest, and I know I say that all the time, but they just always intrigue me. Dr. Ira Byock is a leading palliative care physician, an author, and a public advocate for improving care through the end of life. He's been a founder of amazing healthcare systems from Dartmouth to Fresno, California to Missoula, Montana, and he's been involved in hospice and palliative care since 1978. He's written 3 books, at least 3 books, 3 that I know of: Dying Well, The 4 Things That Matter Most, and The Best Care Possible, his most recent book from 2012. Today, he and I will be focusing on the book, The 4 Things That Matter Most. It came out in 2004 and then was reissued with a 10th anniversary edition. And I can't believe this book is 20 years old. It's so relevant. Enjoy my conversation with Dr. Byock. Welcome, Dr. Byock. Nice to see you.
Nice to see you too. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so you've written several different books. Do you want to just start off by telling us some of those titles? Because I think we're going to kind of focus on the 4 things that matter most, but you've got others.
Wonderful. Well, sure. So I've been a doctor in this field since, the late 1970s, and I didn't plan it that way. My first book is called Dying Well, and I wrote it in 1995, 96, looking back at my career at that time and trying to tell the story through my own experience of how I, who thought I was going to be a rural family doctor in the Rockies, that was my dream in going to medical school and residency, got kind of pulled into caring for people who were facing the end of life. And it's a book of stories. All my books are books of stories. Dying Well opens with my dad's story, my dad, Seymour Byock, was living with pancreatic cancer, which, as the story, it's the first chapter in Dying Well is Cy's story, my dad. It opens with me diagnosing him over the phone as he was telling me about becoming jaundiced. And he was in New Jersey, where I grew up on the Jersey Shore, and I was in Fresno, California, doing my family practice residency. And I had this sort of cold sweat when I realized, oh my God, my dad is dying. So it starts with his story, and then it's a number of stories of people who I met during residency, and then when I was a hospice physician in Missoula, Montana, who taught me something about the experience of well-being during one's dying. Dying Well, I chose the title to a large extent as a contrast with the phrase good death, which was and still is sort of used way too often. And Dying Well, it's a gerund. It gives you a sense that you're living while you're dying. But the word well is not just an adverb describing the process. It's really more provocative to hear it as an adjective describing a person who is dying. Can somebody die well? Can they be well within themselves? That has been the thread that has ended up captivating me and directing my career, and what I've written about in several different books now. Dying Well is a book of 8 or 10 stories of people I had the privilege of knowing or caring for through the end of life, each of whom illuminated some other aspect of well-being. And then we'll talk about the 4 things that matter most, which was my effort to sort of distill what I would call the work of life completion from a developmental human development frame, particularly completing relationships. When we can come back to that. And then my most recent book, published now 10 years ago, while I was working at Dartmouth in directing the palliative care program at Dartmouth in New Hampshire, is called The Best Care Possible. And it's about basically about highly personalized care for people who are seriously ill, because the best care possible is what everybody wants. When you or someone you love is seriously ill, you want the best care possible. But what it means may be entirely different for one person than another. I mean, my dad had pancreatic cancer, and he was, 63 or something when he was living with pancreatic cancer. And what was right for him, what was the best care for him, might be entirely different than somebody who's 63 and comes from a different background and has just different idiosyncratic values and preferences and just is a different person. Because the nature of illness is personal. It's not just medical. And while that seems so, well, sure, duh, in fact, within healthcare and frankly, within the dominant American culture, we kind of default to assuming that if you're seriously ill, your experience is somehow medical, fundamentally medical. And we get it wrong, man. Everybody gets it wrong. So I've written about the personal experience of illness and the phenomenon of well-being through the end of life.
That's so powerful. I just want to underscore that when you are diagnosed with something, when you discover that you have a disease, and maybe it's a life-limiting disease, that is a personal experience, and we wrap it in a medical field and kind of assume that treatments and response and your age and your stage and all that will be somewhat fit in a package, when in fact it just doesn't. And what it means to go through through that health crisis or through dying is such a personal event. And I love the word, like, it's a communal event too, borrowing that from Barbara Carnes. She says dying is not a medical event, it's a community event, and it impacts the dying person and everyone around them.
Yes. So I would say it's a personal experience, but because whole persons, are individuals within the context of families, really their households and their communities. For me, by understanding that it's personal, you wrap in when one person has a serious illness, serious diagnosis, the family, his or her family, shares in the illness. Right. And so does his or her community. And I go through this. I mean, it's important to me because as a physician who started as a family doc, but has, went on to practice, well, I practiced emergency medicine as well, because when I was doing hospice care, you couldn't just be a hospice doctor. You couldn't put food on the table at home if you were a hospice doctor. But I was an emergency doc, but also as a hospice and palliative care doc. If I can keep in my mind that the patient I'm serving their personal experience, I have enormous value to add, bringing medical technology, the diagnostics and therapeutics to bear, but it's always in service of their personal experience. And unfortunately, we often, particularly doctors, I think, tend to assume that the personal will be subordinated to the medical. And so do we as patients. And by the way, let me hasten to say that that's entirely appropriate sometimes when, to subordinate your personal experience, because you got to get medical things done. But it's not always appropriate.
Right. If it's an emergency room situation and you've got to just get that wound closed or deal with that back that broke or something, you're going to just do the technical thing. But so many times it's the person and the personal experience.
And as illness progresses and medical technology and therapeutics, frankly, has less to offer in terms of the physiology or living longer, the personal clearly has to take priority to the medical. The medical is there then to support the person.
Right. I think about that term slow medicine. There's, I think they call it the slow medicine movement, which is kind of how in your elder years or living with a terminal illness, do you create some slow medicine for yourself? So that's a little bit more, I think, supporting the personhood.
Yes.
So I'm guessing that out of that first book and those early experiences in your career, those must have been where the themes really developed for the book that we're going to talk about now, which is this
Sure.
4 things that matter most. And I found it so interesting to realize this was published in 2004, and I had picked up the 10th anniversary edition. I mean, it's almost 20 years old and so relevant still, don't you feel?
Thanks. Yeah, because firstly, I didn't invent any of this stuff. Of course, this stuff is embedded in wisdom traditions that go back forever. There's a Hawaiian, or old Hawaiian tradition that uses these 4 things that I didn't know about when I wrote this book. I learned this from this wisdom from social workers and nurses back in Fresno, California in the 1970s. But the 4 things, just so we let your listeners know, aren't things at all. They're 4 sentences, 11 words. Please forgive me. I forgive you. Thank you. I love you. Please forgive me and I forgive you, because there's not been a perfect relationship on the planet in the history of our species. Even the most close and loving relationships tend to be marked by some history of hurt feelings, misunderstandings, fallouts, but sometimes real transgressions and disloyalties and betrayals and all of that stuff that happens because life is messy. Please forgive me, I forgive you. Thank you and I love you is so often like stating the obvious. But it's so important, particularly in these circumstances of people facing the end of their lives, to say it out loud. And I wrote this, and frankly, this does go back to my earliest experience. And in Dying Well, I talk about saying the 5 things before you die. Please forgive me, I forgive you, thank you, I love you, goodbye. And that would be part of so many lectures I gave and things I taught to my colleagues and medical students, and discussions at hospice team meetings, but also at conferences and all of blah, 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 all this stuff that I was doing as a much younger hospice doc, trying to help build the field and change healthcare, at least, and maybe our culture. And not uncommonly, somebody would come up to me after, let's say, a lecture and say, I loved those 5 things are great, but Dr. Byock, you don't have to be dying to say those things, right? And I, of course, say, absolutely, thank you very much. You're absolutely right. And I'd go on and somewhat embarrassed to say, it took a few years, and I finally started to realize everybody who says that to me has a story.
Yes.
I really want to collect those stories. So I started pretty deliberately saying, would you like to talk? I'd love to talk to you and just get your story. Or
tell me more about that.
Tell me more, right? So I started to collect stories, and then after a time, I had this sense that we weren't going to change healthcare. Not every seriously ill person was going to probably have a doctor or a hospice team, or even, as it was developing, a palliative care team to guide them in these normal tasks of completing relationships, right? Honoring and celebrating relationships, really, because it is what matters to people, And I decided I have to teach the public. I have to talk to the public directly. I have to have a dialogue with the culture, because this one we can do for ourselves. This is not like insight therapy or something that has how can I say it, counseling that has risks.
Right. You don't need an expert. You don't need
Right?
expertise in this to be guided in this. This is really simple.
This is pretty simple. Asking for and offering forgiveness, expressing gratitude and love are about the least toxic, most positive things people can do.
Right. And I love that by writing the book and saying, let's put this more out to the public, you were also saying, let's do this younger. Let's not wait till the dying moment. Let's, as you said, hey, Dr. Byock, this doesn't have to be for dying. This can be at any occasion, at any conversation, at any moment. There can be these sudden openings of gratitude that can really alter relationships.
Yes, and forgiveness that can alter
I love
relationships.
I
It's
love you say in the
it's
book,
such
you say
secret sauce.
yeah, it's so good. You say in the book, you say, forgiveness is maybe the least understood or the most
Yes.
misunderstood. Say more about forgiveness.
Well, we think somehow forgiveness is about redemption or absolving somebody who harmed you of their responsibility, right? And that's just nonsense. And there's this phrase "forgive and forget," which is the stupidest phrase or a little nostrum in the English language. I mean, for one thing, forgiveness requires remembering.
Right.
If you can't remember, that's amnesia. That's not forgiveness, right? So forgiveness means um, uh, means accepting that the past cannot be changed, right? The forgiveness means giving up all hope of a better past, right? But acknowledging that the past need not control your future. It's a letting go of things. But if somebody harms you, if you're in business and somebody buys something on loan and never pays you back, right? You can forgive the debt. You don't have to let it accrue interest. You can take the loss one time, right? It doesn't mean that you're going to do it again, but you don't have to walk around with that on your books, right? That
That's
emotional
the
forgiveness
metaphor.
is
Right.
is is similar,
You don't have to walk around with it on your books.
right? Or carrying that burden on your shoulder, right?
Yeah.
You can let it go, and it's just a happier thing. And expressing, people say, well, Dr. Byock, or as a hospice and palliative care doc, and having cared for so many people who are facing the end of life, what's that taught you about? How's that changed your life? I'd love to tell you
That's a
that
good imitation. I like that.
I, I wish I could say I never screw up anymore. I never say the wrong thing. I never snap at somebody I love, like my dear wife, but that would be a lie.
Right.
What it has done, what I've learned is to apologize far earlier and more authentically. And in apologizing, how I understand apologizing is, it is standing in front of somebody who you care about and acknowledging. It's almost like standing naked in front of them. They can see all of your imperfections, all of your warts, and say, will you still accept me? I am so embarrassed about, I'm ashamed of myself having done that. Even if it's a small infraction, there's a little touch of, well, I'm really ashamed of myself, right? Will you still take me? Can we? And it basically is a statement that this relationship means more to me than how embarrassed I feel right now.
Right.
Right? It works out well, usually, if that is accepted. And ironically, though I'm not going to say this is a strategy for strengthening relationships, ironically, in my experience, relationships tend to get stronger after you've, you know, apologized in an authentic way to somebody.
There's a softening, right? And in that softening is kind of our vulnerability. And in our vulnerability is our connection, I think. I love
Exactly.
I love you say that one interviewer said to you, okay, Dr. Byock, I should do my interviewer voice. Dr. Byock, you say the no, the kernel of the book in the first paragraph, these 11 words.
Right.
Why write a whole book about it? And I
Right. He
love
actually said, "Why would anybody buy this book?" And
so
and and I and this was on my satellite book tour. As I was actually trying to sell books during those 2 weeks. And I, my first thought was, oh, good point. and but
I read that in the book cover. I read it on the inside flap. What do I need to buy this for?
exactly. But but the real answer is because it all sounds so preposterous. Unless you read the stories, and since you read the book, I choose some really tough stories. The stories carry the lessons that even in pretty seriously fractured relationships, and when real transgressions have happened or anger is entirely legitimate, um, healing is possible. If I were to say healing is possible without that, it sounds like some sort of pop psychology or woo woo,
Right.
and that's not where I'm coming from.
Right. There's a beautiful one I remember kind of early in the book where there's a couple and the man is very angry at the woman and she's dying and he says, well, I can say maybe please forgive me and I forgive you and maybe thank you, but I am not going to say I love you. I'm too angry. There's been too much hurt through the years and I won't say it. And the person who's working with him, they end up talking about, well, maybe when you're in bed at night, maybe just whisper, I love you to her back and see what happens. And he does that. He lies in bed one night and he whispers to her back, I love you. And then he feels that connection that he had with his wife in all their early years together and all the long, long years they've been together. And the transgressions kind of disappear. And he leans over and he actually says, I love you. And she turns to him and responds in kind and says, you've been my rock. And I'm so grateful. And it completely alters their relationship and creates what I would call a dying well situation, right? Where this almost impossible gratitude and connection that neither of them thought were possible actually arises between them.
If it didn't happen, you wouldn't believe it. Right?
Exactly. It'd be like a bad fiction book.
No, I'm sorry. That'll take months or years on the couch in therapy to work through this one. But the fact is, and this is something about serious illness particularly, though it's not restricted to serious illness, but somehow when one or the other person is living with a life-threatening condition or knows that time is short, there is this sort of catalytic energy or opportunity to mend and tend relationships. It's quite remarkable. Again, I started as a family doc. That was my training, and I imprinted on human developmental theory, and I think what I've been doing through my career is trying to bring some definition to and teach this notion of human development through the end of life, that serious illness and knowing that you're in a stage of life called dying is an entirely normal stage of human life. And it comes with its own serious challenges and risks of suffering, absolutely. And it also comes with particular developmental tasks and opportunities.
And say more about those. You talked about completion and especially completion of relationships.
So there's completion of your worldly affairs. There's just doing the practicalities of closing, bank accounts or giving your passwords to people you love, including not only your financial stuff, but your Facebook account or so that they can close it, doing, making sure they don't have to go through probate by changing, your will or the title of the home or your fiduciary will, your financial will. There's turning over projects that mean a lot to you, to others. There's, again, making sure there's nothing left unsaid, critically important left unsaid between you and people you love. I think there's also something very healthy in deliberately celebrating life and relationships. If you have the time, if your medical condition allows you the time and energy to do so, there is something life affirming about having a celebration, letting people celebrate you and maybe even roast you at a party, but also having it be a dialogue and letting them know how much you love them and just reminiscing together. I think there's a healthy defiance in our relationship to the force majeure, to death, that says, even death can't take this from us. We matter, right? This relationship is important. This community is important. This family is important. And damn it, death, death is not going to take that from us. We're going to celebrate in the face of it all.
Beautiful. I think that takes a huge amount of courage. Because
It's
you're not talking about denial. You're talking about in the face of still being willing to claim our humanity and our community and our relationships and our loved ones as vastly important to us.
That's right. I really do think that these are developmentally important opportunities that we have in the difficult, inherently difficult, unwanted time of life we call dying. I'm not trying to put a lipstick on this pig or look at it through rose-colored glasses, to change metaphors. Dying sucks, right? You can quote me, but it doesn't only suck.
Oh, I'm going to quote you on that. Yeah, there was a part in the book when you talked about tending that I was going to read that was so great. You say, because of my work with patients of many ages, backgrounds, and life circumstances, I know that this kind of healing is not just a matter of luck. And I think that's so important. As a doctor, I cannot heal relationships between other people any more than I can will the grass to grow. I can prepare them for healing, plant some seeds, keep careful watch, and nurture any evidence of growth. In the plowing and planting and tending of the emotional and spiritual healing process, words are my most valuable tools, and they can become yours too. And I really liked that part, that this isn't luck. This isn't that some people mended their relationships and other people just don't. This is making a deliberate choice to use these 11 words or whatever words come to you to step into that completion, as you call it.
Exactly. And if anybody's, listening and thinking to themselves, yeah, right. You're my audience. You are my audience. I picked stories to address because I would be that reader, right?
Skeptical.
I'm the yeah, right. Sounds too glib. It's the stories that I think open people up to the possibility of, well, maybe so. Okay. There's no harm in trying. And I go through that a fair amount in the book too, right? You can only take care of your side of any relationship. But if you show up and that's 90% of life is showing up. The other 10% turns out entails arriving with good intentions. Show up, arrive with good intentions. Whatever happens, you've taken care of your side of the relationship.
So well put. So well put. Well, I just love how you've encapsulated a lot of life experience and a lot of people's stories into, you've really distilled it down to something pretty simple. And as you said, I love that you say, this is not yours alone. It's not like you made this up. Many, many traditions have come to this same kind of sense of these are what matters. These demonstrations of these words are what heal relationships. And I go back to what you said in the beginning about this really important piece about how it is possible, even in the face of death, to die well.
Exactly. I think that should be the next big thing in American culture.
Oh, say more.
We're all about well-being in American culture, but it's about physical health. So, we buy organic foods and we jog and swim and bicycle long distances and we wear seatbelts and bicycle helmets and we floss, right? But well-being is possible. Internal well-being, being right with oneself, right with one's family, right with the world, right with one's maker. That's also possible. And that's possible through the very end of life. You can be well within yourself. Even during the period of time that we would consider you to be dying. And again, and as an old doc, my fondest goals for the people who were my patients, who are my patients, is that they be well, right? I
Yeah.
can't make anybody immortal, but if I can support them in being well as they leave this life, man, that does it for me.
That's it. That's it. That makes me think of another great writer, Stephen Jenkinson, in his book, Die Wise. He says, dying wise is an act of love. It carries an abiding faith in life. It carries love for the world, and it asks that same faith and love of those who attend to it when it comes. Dying well is not the end of parenting, but the fullness of parenting, not the end of a marriage, but the last great act of a married life. Dying well is a bequest that you leave to those you love, probably the only thing that in the end will not be eaten by moths, apportioned by lawyers, or bought for quarters in a yard sale.
Beautiful.
Dying well is the way you could be known by those you won't live long enough to meet, the way by which they might feel loved by you even after you are gone. Yeah. Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time, Dr. Byock. I just really appreciate what you bring and what your books are bringing to the world. And I love this. Let's make dying well the new trend.
I think that's what it should be. I think it will transform people's lives to realize that they don't have to fear dying. They don't have to, look forward to it, but that it's just another part of being human. It is about full and healthy living. Remarkably
so. We're not dying. Some people say we're alive and then we're dead. So how can that dying period be about living? Yeah.
Well, thank you very much for having me. It's been a
Thank
pleasure.
you so much for the conversation. I really appreciate it. You've been listening to the Best Life, Best Death podcast with Dr. Ira Byock. You can find out more about him and all the many, many good things he does in the world at irabyock.org. And you can find out more about the work I do at bestlifebestdeath.com. Thanks for listening.